Hey people, it's Niles talking. Now this is another Black Heroes video. This is Steve Biko. It's taken from essayhistory.org.za, I think that's South Africa. So here it goes. Stephen Bantu Biko was a popular voice of black liberation in South Africa between the mid-1960s and his death in police detention in 1977. This was the period in which both the ANC and the PAC had been officially banned, and the disenfranchised black population, especially the youth, were highly receptive to the prospect of a new organization that could carry their grievances against the apartheid state. First, it was that Biko's Black Consciousness Movement, BCM, came to prominence, and although Biko was not its only leader, he was its most recognizable figure. It was Biko, along with others, who guided the movement of student discontent into a political force unprecedented in the history of South Africa. Biko and his peers were responding to developments that emerged in the high phase of apartheid, when the Nationalist Party, NP, in power for almost 2 decades, was restructuring the country to conform to its policies of separate development. The NP went about untangling what little pockets of integration and proximity there were between white, black, colored, and Indian people by creating new residential areas, new parallel institutions, such as schools, universities, and administrative bodies, and indeed new countries, the tribal homelands. Though Biko was killed before his 31st birthday, his influence in South Africa was and continues to be profound. Aside from the BCM, he is also credited with launching the South African Students' Organization, SASO, which was created as a black alternative to the liberal National Union of South African Students. It is necessary to disambiguate this move, as Biko is frequently misunderstood to have been anti-white. This categorization is demonstrably untrue, as Biko had no issue with white people per se. His target was always, ultimately, white supremacy and the apartheid government. The decision to break away from NUSAS and the formation of the BCM was rather to create distance from liberal sympathizers who could attempt to speak for their black counterparts, but were nonetheless, by virtue of their race, beneficiaries of an iniquitous system. Biko is best remembered for empowering black voices, instilling a sense of black pride similar to Cesar and Senghor's negritude, and for taking the liberation struggle forward and galvanizing the youth movement. Biko was born in Tarkastad in the Eastern Province, now Eastern Cape, on 18th December 1946, the third child of Mazinge Biko and Nokuzola Masefe Duna. I apologize if I'm not reading that right. Mazinge worked as a policeman and later as a clerk in the King Williamstown Native Affairs Office. An intelligent man, he was also enrolled in the University of South African Affairs, UNISA, the distance learning university, but did not complete enough courses to get his law degree before he died. In 1948, the family moved to Ginsberg Township, just outside of King Williamstown in today's Eastern Cape. The Bikos eventually owned their own house in Zola Street in the Brownie section of Ginsberg. This despite Nokuzola's meager income as a domestic worker. Mazinge died suddenly in 1950 when Steve was 4 years old. His mother subsequently raised the children on her own, working as a cook at Gray's Hospital. Steve's elder brother, Kaya, was politically active as well as enjoying sports. He started a rugby club called Sea Lions, which later morphed into Star of Hope Rugby Club. Kaya was well-read and well-spoken, and he became a reporter for the school newspaper at Forbes Grant School and got involved with the local branch of the Pan-Africanist Congress, PAC, a political tendency which had a strong presence in the area. After coming under the influence of Malcolm Diani, who was also a Forbes Grant, Kaya was made the secretary of the local branch, and he tried to use the Star of Hope Rugby Club to recruit people into the PAC. Steve was known as a joker by his friends and schoolmates. Sinzogowa, Nadiko Mos, Sifo Makwedini, and Sifiwo Seko. Around 1952, the exact date varies from source to source, he went to Charles Morgan Higher Primary School, where he started Standard 3, grade 5. His teacher, Damzi Monaheng, who remembered him as a naughty boy who was always barefoot, recommended that he be promoted to Standard 5, so he skipped Standard 4. I don't know how the South African school system works. Although his friends never saw him study, he was one of the brightest kids in the class, and he helped the other kids when they did not understand their lessons. Steve passed Standard 6 in 1959, and in 1960 he went on to Forbes Grant, a school for which many passed to become prominent figures in post-apartheid South Africa. At Forbes, Steve eventually befriended Larry Bekwa, who had been expelled from Lovedale College after he took part in a strike protesting against South Africa becoming a republic in 1961. Steve proved to be a high school student, excelling in mathematics and English. In 1962, at the age of 16, Steve and Larry completed their junior certificate, grade 10. Steve then went to Lovedale, where his brother Kaya was already a student. However, in April, Steve was taken into custody by the police, who came to the school to arrest Kaya, who was suspected of being involved with Poco, the armed wing of the PAC. The police took brothers. Hang on. The police took both brothers to King Williamstown, 60 kilometers away, and Kaya was charged. He was given a sentence of 2 years with 15 months suspended and served his term at Fort Glamorgan Jail near East London. Steve was released and returned home, but he ran away from Ginsburg to live with his friend Larry Beckwith in Petty, Eastern Cape for the rest of the year. Nevertheless, he continued going to classes at Lovedale, where he became friends with Barney Pitjana, who was at the school on an Andrew Smith bursary. The political tensions at Lovedale were palpable, and Steve arrived at the school soon after Fabo Mabeki had been expelled following strikes by students. Following Kaya's arrest, Steve was interrogated by the police, and subsequently he was also expelled from Lovedale after only attending for 3 months. This incident inculcated in Steve a strong resentment toward white authority, which would shape his political career. Kaya was barred from attending any school after his release from prison, so he began to work as a clerk for a law firm. Concerned about his younger brother's education, he wrote to various schools and got Steve accepted at St. Francis College, a Catholic boarding school outside Durban in Marion Hill in Natal, now KwaZulu-Natal, in 1964, where he began doing Form 4. By now, after his brush with the police, Stevie had become politicized. Kaya remembered, Steve was expelled for absolutely no reason at all, but in retrospect, I welcome the South African government's gesture of exposing a really good politician. I had unsuccessfully tried to get Steve interested in politics. The police were able to do in one day what had eluded me for years. This time, the great giant was awakened. Steve was in illustrious company at Marion Hill, and he thrived, becoming the vice chairs of the St. Francis College's Literary and Debating Society. He became friends with Jeff Bakwa, who described Steve's burgeoning analytical and political capacities during a discussion about Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe's unilateral declaration of independence. We needed clarity on UDI in Rhodesia, and that's where Steve shone. And when Churchill died, Steve was there to describe the political implications. He was able to make all these connections and link them to what was going on in South Africa. Steve underwent the traditional Xhosa initiation rites at his uncle's house in Suwelitsha, King Williamstown, in December 1964, and returned to St. Francis as a man in 1965, according to the author Zolela Mangu. Although I don't want to go too off this, but this relates to what I was saying in a video about Tiwani and Black Americans, manhood rituals. So this is an example of how we could have more manhood rituals, but don't want to get too off the point. Let's keep going. After matriculating from St. Francis with very good grades, Steve was admitted to Durban Medical School at the University of Natal, non-European section UNNE, at the beginning of 1966. Known as Wentworth, Steve lived in the Alan Taylor Residence, segregated living quarters for black students at Natal University, now known as the University of KwaZulu-Natal, UKZN. The black section had its own student representative council, which was a member of the National Union of South African Students. Steve was elected to the SRC in his first year and became involved in NUSAS politics, attending the annual NUSAS conference for the first time. But even before he went to the conference, he was engaged in debates about the role of NUSAS, especially since white students dominated the body, there being more whites than blacks at South African universities at the time. The African National Congress aligned African Students Association, ASA, was in favor of remaining in NUSAS, while the PAC aligned African Students Union of South Africa, ASUSA, was in favor of breaking off from the supposedly national student body. At this time, Steve befriended Aubrey and Mokowape, who had been involved with the PAC and engaged in frequent debates about the NUSAS question. Mokowape was against remaining in NUSAS, while Steve argued that it was useful to belong to the organization because of its resources, if not for any other reason. In July 1967, the young Steve went to the NUSAS conference at Rose University in Grahamstown, Eastern Cape. His second appearance at the annual gathering, the Wentworth students traveled to Grahamstown by train and debated the affiliation issue during their trip, resolving to pull out of NUSAS if the organizers adhered to apartheid legislation by housing the black students separately. Biko recalled the circumstances while giving evidence at the Sasso BBC trial in 1975. It so happened that when we got to Rhodes University in the first instance, the conference organizer could not quite say where we were going to stay. We were all put in the hall in different places and eventually noticed that the white students went first, then some of the Indian students, and eventually he came to us to say he had found a church where we could stay. At that moment, I felt we had ample reason to stick to our decision on the train. In a letter to SRC presidents written in February 1970, after Steve had been elected president of Sasso, he wrote, "In the NUSAS conference of 1967, the blacks were made to stay at a church building in the Grahamstown location. each day being brought to the conference site by cars, etc. On the other hand, their white bros were staying in residence around the conference site. This is perhaps the turning point in the history of black support from NUSAS. So appalling were the conditions that showed the blacks just how valued they were in the organization. The students were indeed fed and housed separately in accordance with the Separate Amenities Act. The black students were aggrieved, but when the NUSAS executive condemned the university for the arrangements, the black students were divided over whether to withdraw their participation. When the conference opened the next day, Steve stood up to deliver his regional report, and he did so in Izzy Souza to drive home the point about black students' alienation from the NUSAS agenda. The president of the University of Witwatersrand-Wits SRC, Robin Margot, proposed a motion to condemn the university council, which the conference passed. Since Steve then proposed that the conference be suspended because the NUSAS organizers had known in advance that the students would be housed separately. After a long discussion, his motion was rejected. The black students felt disadvantaged by the small number, by the use of English as the medium of the conference, and by the distance between their concerns and those of the white students. Steve and his fellow black students walked out. Steve left the conference and went to Port Elizabeth, Eastern Cape, to see Barney Pitjana, who had just attended the launch of the University Christian Movement, UCM, in Rosettenville in Johannesburg, Transvaal, now Gauteng. A law student at Fort Hare University, Pitjana was when many students later expelled from the university in 1969. The UCM was led by Colin Collins and Basil Moore, both radical priests who introduced the ideas of black theology to South Africans. They forged links with the South African Council of Churches, with the Christian Institute, and with the South African Institute of Race Relations. The UCM would play an important role in facilitating the birth of SASO. Steve traveled throughout the country to caucus for the creation of a black-only student body. Pitjana was initially opposed to the idea but was swayed by Biko, after which he became a staunch supporter of the idea and Biko's most important lieutenant. Stutterheim, 1968. At the UCM conference in Stutterheim in July 1968, Steve and his black comrades were faced with a situation similar to the one at the Rhodes Conference a year later. The students had to leave the venue after 72 hours, travel to a black township, and then return. All this so they would not break the law that prevented blacks from being in a white area for more than 72 hours. The move irritated Biko, who felt it was hypocritical. After the conference, Steve, Pitjana, and others met at Biko's home in Ginsberg, 35 kilometers from Stutterheim, to discuss the launch of a black-only student body. Steve was tasked with the mobilization of black students from all black campuses. They went to Fort Hare to attend a meeting of black Christian students' bodies where Basil Moore was to be the main speaker, but Moore was not allowed to speak, and Steve was asked to be the main speaker. The meeting was meant to see the establishment of a UCM branch at Fort Hare, which did take place, but more importantly, students there resolved to join in the formation of the South African Students' Organization. At Fort Hare, students were polarized between those who wanted to re-establish the SRC and those opposed to the move, with Justice Mulatto supporting the former and Pitjana the latter. Mulatto became the president of UCM and was thus well positioned to provide the financial aid for SASO when it emerged. Despite these developments, Steve was still open to NUSAS, hoping to form a pressure group within the national organization rather than severing ties with it. Meanwhile, Biko was living at the Alan Taylor residence, where his close friends included Fuyelwa Mashalaba, Charles Sibisi, Chapman Palweni, and Gulam Giz Abram, an Indian medical student from Benoni, east of Johannesburg. Later, the group was joined by Ben Nagubani and Ben Mugawa. Fuyelwa Mashalaba Biko met Mamfela Ramfele, who began her second year medical studies at UNNE in 1968. For the NUSAS Conference at Wits University in 1968, the president of the Wits SRC, John Kane Berman, ensured that problems regarding accommodation would not be repeated, and the Congress was largely uneventful, according to Biko. But when an Afrikaner student delivered his report in Afrikaans, Giz Abraham delivered a report in Urdu, while Steve delivered his in Izzy Souza. When at the conclusion of the proceedings, the white students sang the South African anthem, Die Stem, the black students sang Nkosi Sikelel iAfrika. Duncan Innes, a close friend of Biko, was elected president of NUSAS after Biko nominated him for the position. When Innes was elected president of NUSAS, Biko congratulated him in a letter on 27th of August 1968. I would like to convey to you congratulations from our local committee on your election as president and a declaration of support and full cooperation during your term of office. In November 1968, Steve again assured Innes that he was not in favor of disaffiliation of NUSAS, but his plan to properly establish SASO continued. Steve sent out invitations to all the black student bodies he had been in contact with on 14th October 1968, asking them to attend the launch of SASO from 1st to 3rd December that year. The students met at Marion Hill in December 1968 and officially founded SASO. I'm just going to stop it there because this is quite a long article, so I'm going to break it up into parts. Please comment, rate, share, and subscribe.